Everyone gets their start sewing a little bit differently, and I'd love to know how you got your start sewing too, so let me know in the comments down below. Some people start sewing by immediately jumping into making their own clothing, while some people prefer to make more useful projects like quilting and making pot holders. And even more people transfer their skills into sewing from other hobbies like knitting and crochet. But I started sewing by making clothing for my dolls with scrap fabric. And I didn't even start sewing clothing for myself for about another 10 years. I was only 4 years old when I picked up my first hand sewing needle, and I was pretty bad at it. But starting hand sewing young helped me pick up the dexterity necessary for making really tight, strong hand sewn stitches, which I think are still important even later on in your sewing journey when you want to make clothing or quilt finishes that have a really nice, seamless looking finish. Many bespoke and couture designers do a lot of hand sewing, so you don't even need to use a machine if you want to learn how to sew. I was 8 years old when I learned how to use a sewing machine, but I didn't get to use it very frequently because I never had a lot of fabric to work with, since I was mostly only able to use my mother's scraps from when she was able to sew. So I ended up doing a lot more knitting and crocheting when I was a kid than actual sewing. I started out by making a ton of scarves, pot holders, and coasters that were a lot like this one, but my grandmother made this one and I thought it was just so cute I had to show you guys. I also knitted this super comfy pair of leg warmers, and by the time I got to middle school, I started making a ton of gloves. I knitted this pair, but I think I ended up crocheting a lot more gloves than I did knitting. I also made a ton of pillows when I was a kid, and this specific design I learned in my 6th grade home ec class that I absolutely loved. And I made a tutorial on this channel for these 9 patch pillow blocks, so if you want to make these, go check that out. And my middle school home ec class was the time when I realized that not many other people knew how to sew. There might have been 1 or 2 other girls that knew how to hand sew or knew how to sew a button going on into that class, but I think I was the only one who knew how to operate a sewing machine. And up until that point, I just assumed everybody knew how to sew because my mother sewed, my grandmother sewed, my older sisters sewed, so I just assumed everybody knew how to do it. And when they canceled my home ec class my 8th grade year, I was devastated. But now I just think that's sad for everyone, because if most kids my age didn't know how to sew going into a home ec class, they're not going to learn how to sew at all if they don't have access to that home ec class either. Then in 8th grade, I started taking over hemming my own pants. I'm only 5 feet tall, so I have to hem up almost every single pair of pants I buy, even ones that I find in the petite sections, because petite pants are made for women who are 5'2". So every year when school started, I'd take my pile of new jeans for school and hem them up myself. And that was a really good way to get started altering clothing to fit myself better. Not that any of these fit right now. That's when I started decorating some of my pant legs with buttons or shoelaces or just little strips from the hem that I cut off I would sew elsewhere onto the pant leg for a little bit of decoration. And then in high school, I finally started making my own clothing. It started out with a Halloween costume because my sister wanted to make a Halloween costume, so of course I had to make a Halloween costume too. We grew up watching our mother sew a lot of Halloween costumes for us, so we thought it would be a lot easier than it ended up being. I was pretty big into the whole ghost hunting, haunting, exorcism, all that, ghostly stuff at the time, so I wanted to be a ghost for Halloween. I picked out a white satin fabric that was very similar to this bow. which is not very ghostly, but that's what I got. I designed my ghost costume with a very similar silhouette as to the one I'm wearing today. It had a fitted bodice, a long sleeve with a flounce at the end, and a nice full skirt. And everybody thought I was a bride, not a ghost. But I still think that's kind of successful since people actually thought I was some sort of Halloween costume. That was my very first attempt at pattern drafting my own clothing, so that ghost costume barely pulled on all the way, but it was pretty comfortable to wear, and I was able to wear like pants and underneath it, so I wasn't too cold on Halloween either. And after making my Halloween ghostly bride costume, I was able to convince my mother to give me bigger scraps of fabric so I could start practicing making more of my own clothing. I do wish I had more of those clothes still, but they weren't very good, so I ended up not keeping them. Then when I was 16, my sisters and I volunteered at a Renaissance fair, and we made almost all of our clothing for that Renaissance fair. Since we had so much to make, we used store-bought patterns for those clothing, and I immediately realized that using store-bought patterns was gonna give me a lot of the same fit issues that buying store-bought ready-to-wear does. The biggest fit problem I had was with the bloomers. That's the medieval Renaissance underwear that was worn under your chemise, but they look like a really large pair of shorts with a drawstring at the top. At the time, I didn't know how to fix the fit issues that I had, and we reasonably didn't have a lot of time before the Renaissance fair that I would have been able to fix them. So I ended up wearing a very uncomfortable pair of bloomers under my Renaissance garb, and that caused a lot of thigh chafing, and they were very, very uncomfortable in the 104-degree heat. And that was really the big turning point when I realized that clothing just isn't made for my body type, and that I could get a better fit from clothing if I sewed my own. So that's when I started taking clothing that I had in my closet that fit me pretty well and cloning those patterns to make something else, but more in a fun design that I liked. And I had pretty mixed results with that. I used mostly old jean material for those sewing projects, so I was pretty limited on what I could make at the time. And when I was 18 years old, I bought a dress form, and I was so excited for it. I started making a lot of really beautiful feminine clothing that actually accented my hourglass waist and wasn't an awkward height for my torso. I personally found using a dress form to draft clothing to be a lot easier than using a store-bought pattern because I have to make so many adjustments to store-bought patterns to fit my body anyway that I find it's just not worth it. You know, depending on the fabric and the cut of the garment, I might be a large or extra large on top, a small or extra small in the waist, and a large or extra large on the bottom, or maybe a medium on any or all of them. So commercial garment patterns are just really awkward for me to grade through, and on top of that, I have to work in a double or triple full bust adjustment and also work in how short I am because I'm petite as well. So it's just really complicated for me to take a pattern and make it fit myself, and a lot easier for me to just draft that pattern on a dress form and have it come out right the first time. I've also tried my hand at flat pattern drafting, which overall I have a little bit of a harder time with due to all the math and trying to get my brain to get all the numbers out right. But flat pattern drafting is the only method I've been able to use to make a pair of pants that fits, even though I did have to alter them just a little bit to get the knee area and the thigh area comfortable for me. I always like to try new things with sewing and teach myself new skills. So after a few years of getting really big into sewing my own clothing, I started quilting, and I made my very first quilt last year. And I am currently working on my second quilt that will probably be done in a few weeks after I finish hand sewing all this binding on. And once I'm done with this quilt, I'm going to go back to sewing some more clothing because I want to have some fun stuff for the summer. So if you like this quilt and want to see what it looks like when it's done, or if you want to see some more fun sewing tutorials for clothing this summer, make sure you subscribe to my channel. Also, make sure you leave a like on this video if you love sewing as a creative hobby just as much as I do. Thank you guys so much for watching my video today. I will see you next week.